Now let's talk about Gilded Age politics and agrarian reform. Gilded Age, of course, refers to the golden age of the robber barons, the very, very wealthy, and the politics that came along with that. And of course, agrarian reform is farmers. It was the movement to address the needs of the farmers of the time. Politically, local politics was more important really than national politics at this point, at least in getting things done. But local politics also had its share of problems, including the uh, the inordinate amount of power that these political bosses had, and the power of what we would call political machines, which are basically political parties who basically ran entire cities, uh, and they would, be the go-to people, the political machines for people wanting jobs, government contracts, and they would require, a kind of a quid pro quo, meaning, I'll give you the jobs if you return something back to me. It's a form of bribery, really, and oftentimes it was just a guarantee that the people in their communities would vote for them. And so people like a Boss Tweed in New York City, who was a political boss there, would basically just speak to the different economic and religious and social leaders of the different parts of the city, and in return for favorable government contracts, favorable treatment, and even just basic services in those parts of the city. In return for those basic services and those other things, those leaders of those communities had to promise and deliver on uh, the vote for Boss Tweed and his cronies to get them elected. So Tammany Hall is what was called was Boss Tweed's kind of political machine, because I believe that was a building where they worked out of. But anyway, so that local politics, especially in the big cities, involved political machines. National politics, there was high party loyalty and high voter turnout. It was some of the highest voter turnout in American history was during this period of the late 1800s, and people, were very loyal to their parties, usually their Democratic Party or Republican Party. But the ironic thing and the kind of the contradictory thing is that very little got done at the national level, even though it was very partisan and there was high voter turnout. There was policy, what we call policy inertia at the national level, meaning because the government was oftentimes divided, meaning different parties would control different parts of the government, like you might have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress or vice versa. It made it difficult to get things done. And there was really not much difference between the parties on major issues. Currency, as we've discussed, the idea of greenbacks versus, gold standard, silver standard, all those things were controversial, and there were differences in that. That maybe was the main difference between the political parties and the different economic factions. As far as regulation, there were some differences there with regard to how much regulation there should be placed on businesses, and this was just a kind of a new issue, not a new issue, but it came to the forefront with the rise of really big businesses in the Gilded Age politics. Steel, farming, oil, all those things, these different industries becoming really bigger than the state governments, and therefore the state governments were unable to regulate them or control these industries and these businesses. Therefore, the national government had to consider whether they should step in and regulate these businesses. Farm policy, how to handle the issues that specifically dealt with farmers and their ability to survive, really, because the fluctuation in farm prices. Civil service, uh, major issues were in civil services. Basically, should they continue with, of course, the spoil system, where basically the elected person can put in office anybody they want, or in positions in government, whoever they want, regardless of their skill level, regardless of their experience. Whereas others argue that running government is an important job that requires experience and skill, and therefore there should be civil service exams. There should be uh, we should hire the most qualified people, not just the people that are friends of the elected political representatives. And then immigration always is an issue, whether not just whether to allow immigrants in, but which immigrants. Um, Now, there's also, like as I mentioned, partisan politics. A lot of patronage and favoritism, as we talked about, kind of that spoil system, where if you get elected, people that helped get you there and get you elected, you gave them favors. You know, you played favorites and gave them the cushy jobs, and you gave them special treatment. Uh, as far as the parties themselves, the Republicans, they tended to be Protestant of British descent. Generally, they dominated the Northeast and the Upper Midwest. They tended to be nativist, meaning they were kind of anti-immigrant, and were prohibitionists. They they not all of them, but the majority of them believed in prohibition and that alcohol was an inherent evil that needed to be outlawed. Democrats tended to be Southern whites, Northern immigrants, and non-Protestants, Catholics and Jews, etc. They did not like the nativist, reactionist policies of the Republicans because many of them were immigrants and they were descendants of immigrants, so they understood that the benefits of immigration. And they also were repelled by the Republicans' moral, quote unquote, moral policies of prohibition and things like that, because they had their own, traditions of social drinking that came with them from Europe. Um, State and local initiatives, basically, the state and local governments were the only governments that really got anything done during this time period. And basically, the things they were focusing on is corporate restraint and regulation, reining in these huge industries, especially the railroads, especially steel, especially oil, reining these in and controlling them so they just don't absolutely control uh, government. And and also to ensure that they consider, the environment and the citizens of the communities in which they do business. Also during this time, you had a corruption. Of course, all politics and all periods of time there is corruption, but there's always usually attempts at reform when this type of corruption occurs and it becomes very blatant. Uh, so uh, So this corruption in this case was just an alliance between politicians and business. And that's usually where the most harmful, economically harmful and inherent corruption does exist. Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican president. These are the presidents really post Reconstruction. Rutherford B. Hayes, he believed in civil service reform, uh, but the Republicans themselves were split on the issue. They were split into groups called stalwarts and half-breeds. Stalwarts were those people who were stalwarts for the spoil system. They benefited from the spoil system. The fact that there was no test to get a job because they were, appointed to positions without any probably skill or experience. Half-breeds, meaning they were kind of halfway Republicans, wanted to reform the spoil system. They believed that good government required experience and qualified people. And so they wanted a civil service test, or at least a system to allow people to achieve positions in government based on merit and not on just who you know. Uh, Hayes, at that time during his presidency, tended to promote conservative economic policies, and that ended up losing him support. Uh, Next up as president was James A. Garfield, who was a Republican who became president after Rutherford B. Hayes. Not long into his first term, he was assassinated by a disgruntled government worker or potential government worker who was unable to get a government job because of the spoils system. Chester Arthur took over for him, and while he was considered an afterthought in the presidential race in which James Garfield won, he became a very serviceable and most historians agree a pretty good president. Chester A. Arthur. One of the most important things he did was pass the Pendleton Civil Service Reforms Act. which basically did away in a lot of ways with the spoils system. It ensured civil service exams, at least for some positions within government, uh, which made it possible to gain employment and gain positions based on merit instead of just who you know. After Arthur, you have the first administration of Grover Cleveland, a Democrat. In his initial election in 1884, he ran against a guy, I believe a senator from Maine named James G. Blane. Uh, and Blane was constantly accused of corruption back in his home state. Uh, and during this time, you see the rise of the mugwumps, who are anti-corruption. The mugwumps were out there to kind of root out corruption, and I'm not really sure why they called themselves the mugwumps. So Blane was his baggage he carried around was his corruption and his history of corruption. And Cleveland, his baggage he carried around was that the whispers were that he had an illegitimate child. And so this was one of the dirtiest mudslinging campaigns in American history. So when you see these presidential elections in the United States where it seems like that they're just really getting down in the muck and becoming, slinging mud at each other. Oh, it was sometimes worse back back in the 1800s. Uh, the Cleveland supporters had a quote for Blane. They would say, "James G. Blane, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine." And Blane's supporters had their chant for Cleveland, where they would follow Cleveland around, and when he gave speeches and chant in the audience, they'd say, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" And in order to highlight, his that rumor that he had an illegitimate child. So anyway, Cleveland ended up winning the race and became president. And he promoted limited government, meaning he wasn't generally pro-regulation or having good national government become a highly regulatory body, but he did support and did pass a law that created something called the Interstate Commerce Commission. And this was a regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, that was created specifically to regulate the railroads and railroad rates. Because one of the problems, and everybody was impacted by it when the railroads did it, was they would overcharge rates in areas of the country where there was only one line of service to make up for the loss of revenue when they were serving railroad lines where there was competition. So like in the Northeast, you would have multiple railroad lines with different companies running from, say, New York to Philadelphia. And so you would have price competition, and whoever had the lowest prices would get the most riders. It's just like anything else in supply and demand. Usually the lower price, that's what people will buy. So the businesses oftentimes made very little profit, if any, in these competitive areas. So to make up for that, in areas where a railroad company had only one rail line, they would just charge exorbitant amounts of money, exorbitant rates on the people that use those lines. And for the most part, these were in rural areas where it was farmers that were that felt the brunt of these high prices. And of course, if it costs them a lot of money to send their goods to market, then of course that means their goods are going to cost more at market, which means it's going to be harder for them to sell them. So the Interstate Commerce Commission was created under Grover Cleveland. Also, Cleveland wanted lower tariffs in order to lower prices, because tariffs increase price. Uh, then in 1888, Benjamin Harris defeats Cleveland in the next election, and at this point, Republicans control all branches of government. Uh, and some of the things passed during this time were the Dependent Pension Act for Civil War veterans, the dependents of Civil War veterans receiving pensions, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was another attempt to limit the powers of these big trusts, specifically oil trusts and railroad trusts. The McKinley Tariff, which lowered lowered tariffs, and there was the admission of quite a few new Western states during this time. Um, the gold standard, which was implemented previously, created economic problems, meaning there was deflation, meaning the prices of goods went down generally, which is not necessarily a good thing. It sounds like a good thing, but it's not, because it creates a shrinking economy, and that is not good. And so because of mainly because of economic problems, the Republicans congressionally suffer big losses in the 1890 midterms, and the Democrats, uh, I believe, take control of Congress. Here's just a couple of pictures of James Blane and Grover Cleveland. And as we'll see, Grover Cleveland was the first president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. He was elected in '84, and he'll get elected, I believe, again in 1892.